In 2013, a violent collision between modern science and a buried past tore apart the veil of silence over 14 years of despair. Liam Wilson, the 5-year-old boy who vanished from Nashville in 1999, was discovered still alive, having grown up normally, safely, and completely unaware that he had once been the name haunting an entire family and a cold case file. For more than a decade, his parents lived in a limbo between hope and a funeral that never took place, while the truth existed right in the midst of American society, hidden under a legal identity, neat records, and a life that seemed utterly innocent. No blood was spilled, no cries for help, no body, just an anomalous moment, a system loophole, and a child erased from his own life. Today we will dive straight into the heart of a silent tragedy that stretched from 1999 to 2013. How Liam disappeared, who stole his identity, and why a system built to protect children remained powerless for all those years. This is not just a missing person case, it is the story of how a person can be robbed of their past, yet continue living, and when the truth rises, it can redeem or destroy everything that remains. Before we delve deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Where suburban neighborhoods still retained a sense of familiarity and safety, where families believed that locking the door on time was enough to protect their children, and where kids were still allowed to play nearby without constant supervision. The Wilson family lived in a neighborhood like that. A typical middle-class family, with a stable life, routine activities, no notable conflicts or unusual signs before the tragedy struck. The father worked full-time, the mother devoted most of her time to the family, and Liam Wilson, age 5, was the center of those daily routines. A child at the curious, moderately active age, easy to talk to with adults, and tending to trust those around him. Liam had a small build, a bright face, light-colored hair, and was often described as well-behaved in the very typical way of children raised in a peaceful environment. On the afternoon of the incident, the person directly supervising Liam was Sarah Wilson, his father's sister, someone familiar with the family's routine, and who often took care of Liam for short periods. Sarah was over 30, lived nearby, knew the child's habits well, and believed that keeping Liam in sight was enough. Since the area was quiet with few strangers passing through, the relationship between Liam and Sarah was close enough for Liam to obey, but relaxed enough that adults didn't feel the need to monitor every small movement, and that very familiarity created a sense of security throughout the afternoon. Everything proceeded normally until a small detail appeared, not significant enough to be seen as an immediate threat. The presence of a stranger in the shared space, with no hurried or suspicious behavior, no direct approach to the Wilson family, simply appearing in view for a short time. Sarah's reaction at that moment was not fear but hesitation, a brief notice quickly soothed by the thought that this was a safe neighborhood, that Liam was right nearby, and that there was no reason to overreact. The initial danger signals thus passed in a vague state, where doubt wasn't strong enough to prompt action, and trust in the familiar environment prevailed. The moment Liam slipped out of control happened in a very short window, when Sarah turned away to handle a simple household task, believing the child was still in the same spot, and when she turned back, Liam was no longer in sight. No cries, no signs of struggle, just the sudden absence of a 5-year-old in a space considered safe. Liam's actions in that moment cannot be clearly determined. All that is known is that he moved out of the familiar area, while Sarah's initial response was to call his name, look around and believe Liam was just hiding, or had gone to a nearby corner. The mistake did not stem from deliberate negligence, but from very human limitations. Underestimating the possibility of something bad happening, over-trusting the familiar environment, and delaying the acknowledgement that a serious situation might be unfolding. As the first minutes passed without Liam returning, anxiety began to spread. The family was called, an instinctive search radius expanded. Sarah and other members checked familiar places, calling Liam's name repeatedly, while neighbors also joined the search in the area. However, each search loop ended without any sign that the child was nearby, and the realization that Liam was no longer within control became clearer. As hope that this was just a minor mix-up began to fade, the family was forced to confront a possibility they had never considered in this peaceful setting, and the final decision was made: contact the police, officially reporting that Liam Wilson had disappeared, marking the moment when an ordinary afternoon in Nashville turned into the beginning of a missing person case that would last many years. The Wilson family's missing person call was received by Nashville's emergency dispatch in the typical context of cases where the system cannot immediately determine the nature, when the caller cannot provide a clear sequence and can only express panic, fragmented and repeating basic information that a child has vanished from supervision in a short time. The operator had to slow the pace of the call, asking procedural questions to establish initial facts, including the victim's identity, age, last seen time, specific location, people present, and actions taken before contacting police. Based on this information, a case file was opened as a missing child, with Liam Wilson's personal data entered into the local tracking system, including physical description, age, residence area, and family relationships. While the urgency level was still being assessed, since there were no signs of criminal activity, the nearest patrol officers were dispatched to the scene to verify the actual situation, while an investigator experienced in juvenile cases was assigned to handle the early stage to ensure systematic information gathering from the first hours. When authorities arrived at the Wilson family's residential area, the initial priority was not deep investigative measures, but stabilizing the situation, confirming the child was truly no longer in the area, and building an overall picture of what happened in the preceding time. Quick interviews were conducted with family members, focusing on Liam's parents and Sarah Wilson, the direct supervisor, aiming to reconstruct the sequence of events as accurately as possible, though aware that initial statements under stress often contain timing and detail errors. Questions centered on Liam's position at each moment, the time adults looked away, people present or appearing in the area, and anything considered unusual compared to daily routine. The responses showed consistency in the general context, but did not fully align on timelines, with differences of just a few minutes, but enough to create hard-to-pinpoint gaps in the initial timeline. And these discrepancies were noted as points needing further clarification. In parallel with the family, external witnesses, mainly neighbors and those near the area at the time, were approached for preliminary information, but most statements were vague, uncertain about seeing Liam or only recalling general details of a child's presence without confirming exact time or direction. Based on initial data, the investigation team decided to classify the case as a missing person without criminal indicators, a common professional choice in situations lacking physical evidence of violence, no direct witnesses to abduction, and no signs of forced removal. This classification did not mean completely ruling out crime, but it shaped the early response, focusing on the possibility the child wandered off or left the area short distance, rather than assuming a graver scenario. Accordingly, the initial search scope was set around the Wilson family's residential area and nearby zones a 5-year-old could reach on foot in a short time, including internal roads, playgrounds, nearby public spaces, and locations familiar to Liam. Points outside this scope were not prioritized due to lack of signs the victim traveled by vehicle or was taken far, reflecting a balance between limited resources and reasonable assumptions based on available data. In the first 24 hours, numerous procedural decisions were made to maintain system control, including internal alerts to patrol units to watch for a child matching Liam's description, preparing basic identification materials for potential use, and updating the file in local tracking system. At the same time, the team faced pressure to balance response speed with avoiding unnecessary community terror, especially without evidence of a broader threat. These decisions were made in a context where time was critical, each passing hour reducing the chance of finding the victim near the scene, but also influenced by the initial assessment that the case might not be criminal. The outcome of the initial investigation setup phase was a relatively complete case file on basic facts, a logically defined search scope for that time, and a response strategy built on the assumption that Liam Wilson might still be somewhere in the familiar area, laying the groundwork for subsequent steps, while the system had yet to recognize the true severity of this disappearance. Immediately after completing the report intake and initial setup phase, the authorities' focus shifted entirely to determining the last reliable time Liam Wilson was seen, because in every child missing case, the last confirmed sighting is the most crucial anchor for building the entire subsequent investigative logic. According to Sarah Wilson's statement, the person directly supervising Liam at the time, Liam remained in her view until just before she turned away for a brief household task, and when she turned back, the child was gone. However, the interval between these moments could not be clock precise, but only estimated subjectively. When investigators asked Sarah to describe in more detail the sequence of actions that afternoon, including what she did for how long, and from which position, gaps began to emerge, as memory under stress does not allow clear minute-by-minute recall. Liam's parents, though present in the area shortly after learning he was missing, could not provide additional data to narrow the time, as they did not witness the moment Liam slipped from supervision. Based on these statements, the team had to designate the last scene as an estimated window, rather than a specific point, which already posed a major challenge for everything that followed. From that uncertain starting point, investigators began constructing a preliminary timeline using available initial data, including when Liam was believed still in the area, when Sarah realized he was out of sight, when the family began spontaneous searching, and when the police call was made. The timeline was built logically, but even during construction, investigators continually noted that many points were relative, based on estimates and memory rather than objective data. When the temporary timeline was laid out for comparison, small but significant inconsistencies emerged, mainly around how different witnesses recalled the same event differently. Some neighbors thought they saw a child resembling Liam in the area at a certain time, while others remembered no child at all then, and no one could definitively confirm what they saw directly related to Liam. These inconsistencies did not create fully opposing scenarios, but were enough to disrupt efforts to build a seamless timeline, as even a few minutes difference could open or eliminate numerous possibilities about the victim's movement direction. The team noted these as unverifiable points, rather than forcing them into a single mold, as doing so early could lead to lasting wrong assumptions. Concurrent with refining the timeline, crime scene assessment was conducted to determine whether the area where Liam was last seen could be treated as a criminal scene. Officers surveyed the area in detail, observing layout, spatial structure, entry-exit points, lines of sight from various positions, and environmental factors that might influence a 5-year-old's behavior, while searching for any physical signs of an unusual event. However, the survey revealed the area had all the characteristics of normal living space: no disturbance, no overturned objects, no personal items of Liam left unusually, and no visible signs of struggle or coercion. The absence of these signs meant the area could not be processed as a standard crime scene, also limiting early forensic evidence collection. Investigators also assessed Liam's potential movement based on age, physique, and habits, considering directions a child could walk in the estimated time, but results only showed open possibilities with no dominant direction. The surrounding area was open with many small paths, internal roads, and connections to adjacent neighborhoods, allowing a child to go fairly far quickly, while making specific direction identification extremely difficult without direct witnesses or physical trace. During the assessment, the team also considered the possibility Liam left with someone else, though no evidence supported this scenario, as no one confirmed seeing him with an adult or boarding a vehicle. Being unable to fully rule out any possibility while also unable to confirm any placed the team in a difficult position where every direction relied more on inference than concrete evidence. When timeline and scene data were synthesized, the preliminary conclusion was that the case lacked a clear starting point for criminal investigation, as the last seen time was not precise enough to narrow space, and the incident area provided no physical signs to confirm the disappearance's nature. The lack of a clear scene meant no basis for deploying advanced physical evidence-based measures, forcing continued reliance on statements, inference, and reasonable assumptions amid limited information. The result of this phase was a provisional timeline with many unfilled gaps, and a scene assessment showing no strong factors to confirm criminal activity on site, creating the foundation for a challenging investigation as time passed, while the system still had not grasped the true nature of Liam Wilson's disappearance. When the process of constructing a timeline and evaluating the scene failed to yield a decisive anchor point, the investigation team was forced to shift to the hypothesis analysis phase, a strategic step in criminal investigations where the goal is not to find an immediate answer, but to identify the most plausible scenarios to guide resource allocation amid limited information. The first hypothesis proposed, and the most natural one in child disappearance cases without signs of violence, was that Liam Wilson had wandered off on his own, a scenario consistent with the quiet residential setting, the victim's age, and the brief lapse in supervision. The team examined Liam's personal characteristics, including his 5-year-old age, ability to move independently over short distances, the innate curiosity of children, and their limited awareness of danger, to assess the likelihood that he had left the familiar area without realizing the consequence. Environmental factors, such as the open layout, numerous small paths and turns, and internal roads leading to adjacent neighborhoods, were also factored in, as they could enable a child to travel farther than adults might expect in a short time. This hypothesis aligned with the absence of disturbance at the presumed last known location, no personal items left behind, and no direct witnesses to unusual activity, while also explaining why the initial searches by family and neighbors yielded no immediate results. However, upon deeper analysis, the team recognized the limitations of the wandering hypothesis. Although a 5-year-old's range might exceed adults' subjective expectations, it still has definite bounds, and the complete lack of confirmed sightings in nearby familiar areas raised questions about the scenario's completeness. The second hypothesis considered was abduction, a more serious possibility that could not be dismissed despite the absence of direct evidence at this stage. The team evaluated the chance that a stranger had exploited the brief supervision gap to approach Liam, particularly given mentions of an unfamiliar individual in the common area prior to the disappearance. Analyzing this hypothesis involved assessing stranger access, the time required to remove a child unnoticed, and the absence of typical abduction indicators, such as cries for help, signs of struggle, or witnesses spotting a suspicious vehicle. The lack of any such elements made the stranger abduction hypothesis difficult to prioritize, as professional experience shows that even quick and discreet abductions often leave at least some trace or indirect testimony. Nevertheless, the team acknowledged that lack of evidence does not rule out the possibility, especially with an imprecise last-seen timestamp creating a window large enough for external intervention to occur undetected. The third hypothesis involved family or acquaintance involvement, a sensitive but mandatory line of inquiry per standard procedure, given statistics showing that in a certain percentage of child disappearances, known individuals play some role. The team conducted a comprehensive review of the Wilson family context, including relationships among members, history of conflict, financial issues, custody disputes, or any factors that might create motive to remove or conceal the child. Initial data showed a stable family life with no social or legal red flags, and the parents' reactions matched typical patterns of panic and distress in unintentional disappearance. For Sarah Wilson, Liam's primary caregiver, the team assessed cooperation, statement consistency, and post-incident behavior, finding no clear signs of evasion or concealment, while noting her proactive involvement in searches and information provision from the outset. These factors led to rating the family involvement hypothesis as lower probability than others, though it remained on file for monitoring if new information emerged. After individually constructing and analyzing each hypothesis, the team proceeded to comparatively assess their relative probabilities using professional criteria, fit with existing data, ability to explain timeline gaps, and frequency in similar cases. The wandering hypothesis ranked highest at that point, as it contradicted no known facts and fit the lack of a clear scene, while abduction ranked low-medium due to absent direct evidence, but was retained for vigilance. Family involvement ranked lowest based on observed data and behavior but was not fully eliminated per investigative caution. On this probability assessment, the team had to decide on priority directions, as pursuing all scenarios equally was infeasible, given limited resources and high time pressure. The operational decision was to focus most resources on verifying and ruling out the possibility that Liam had wandered within the area and nearby zones, while maintaining monitoring of information related to other scenarios, to avoid missing a serious development. This decision reflected a balance between evidence-based logic and the need for rapid action in the critical early hours, when safely locating the victim still heavily depended on correctly scoping space and time, while illustrating how initial reasonable assumptions can shape the entire investigative trajectory in the case's next phase. Once the initial investigative hypotheses were established and a temporary priority direction selected, the focus shifted to a sensitive and decisive phase. Identifying individuals potentially linked to Liam Wilson's disappearance and conducting an elimination process based on what could be verified amid limited data. The team's first task was compiling a list of Liam's known associates, as in child-related cases, individuals with direct or indirect ties to the victim are typically examined first due to access and familiarity with routine. This list included close family members, frequently visiting relatives, parents' close friends, familiar neighbors, and anyone confirmed present in Liam's activity area around the incident time. Each person was included not due to incriminating evidence, but for meeting one or more professional criteria regarding access opportunity in the brief window before disappearance. Investigators verified each individual's schedule, cross-referencing independent statements on time, location, and activities that day, while noting consistency across accounts. They paid special attention to unexplained time gaps or details repeated mechanically, as these could indicate innocent confusion or possible concealment. However, most associates were quickly deemed lacking clear motive and realistic opportunity, as their schedules were verifiable via independent sources or did not overlap with the estimated incident window. Parallel to the known associates list, a second list of potential strangers was built from vague witness accounts of unfamiliar individuals in the area before and shortly after Liam's disappearance. This list was broader and less specific, as most descriptions were generic, lacking clear identifiers for confident identification. Investigators collected all community reports of strangers, unfamiliar vehicles, or unusual behavior, no matter how minor, as in a case lacking a scene or physical evidence. Any detail could become crucial. Evaluating strangers proved more challenging than known associates due to absent data for verifying schedules, motives, or victim connections, leaving many cases in insufficient information status rather than definitive elimination. For each individual on both lists, the team applied a uniform evaluation framework centered on two core factors: motive and opportunity. Motive was broadly considered, not limited to obvious criminal drivers like grudges, material gain, or personal conflicts, but including circumstances leading to impulsive acts, psychological deviance, or unpredictable situational factors. Opportunity was assessed by access to Liam in the specific time and space, including presence in the area, ability to approach unnoticed, and conditions for leaving with the victim undetected. Most evaluated individuals, especially known associates, failed to meet both factors simultaneously and were thus rated low relevant. Based on these assessments, elimination proceeded systematically, with individuals cleared from suspicion upon sufficient grounds, concluding no motive, no opportunity, or incompatibility with established case facts. Each elimination decision was documented in detail with specific professional rationale to ensure transparency and enable future review if new information arose. However, the team recognized that early eliminations under incomplete information carry inherent risk. Some individuals were cleared early based on assumptions they did not fit high-risk statistical profiles or lacked suspicious history, while minor details about them received less scrutiny. Additionally, prioritizing the wandering hypothesis influenced evaluations, making those inconsistent with it easier to eliminate. Erroneous eliminations, though not immediately identifiable, stemmed from combined factors: pressure to narrow scope quickly, reliance on most common scenarios, and data limitation. In this context, the team balanced the risk of overlooking a key individual against efficient progress, as retaining too many unsubstantiated suspects could paralyze the investigation. The outcome of the suspect and elimination phase was a progressively narrowing list, not from solving the case, but from ruling out possibilities deemed reasonable at the time, creating an investigative state where suspects decreased, but certainty did not correspondingly increase. This state clearly reflected the limits of early-stage investigation, where the system makes critical decisions based on probability and experience rather than concrete evidence, while laying groundwork for long-term consequences of high-pressure, incomplete information operational choices. After initial investigative hypotheses were set and suspect scoping temporarily implemented, Nashville's entire response system shifted to continuous action mode, with absolute focus on organizing the search for Liam Wilson as early as possible, based on professional judgment that if the child had not been taken far, detection odds depended directly on deployment speed and scope in the first days. Search operations were structured by clear zones, starting from the presumed last seen point and rapidly expanding in concentric circles, each defined by a 5-year-old's realistic movement range over varying durations from minutes to hours. Patrol units were assigned specific sub-areas with detailed marked maps to avoid overlap or gaps, tasked with visually scanning all potential concealment spots, such as narrow paths between houses, vacant lots, backyards, densely vegetated areas, outbuildings, sheds, large containers, and any space a child could access or accidentally hide in. Searches ran in continuous shifts, ensuring each area was covered multiple times under different lighting, weather, and timing conditions to minimize human or environmental oversights, while maintaining steady, official presence over extended periods. Alongside regular police units, local rescue teams were mobilized for hard-to-reach areas, while volunteer search teams and community members were coordinated for specific tasks, creating a widespread network combining expertise and local knowledge. Community mobilization was controlled, with basic descriptions of Liam disseminated for recognition and immediate reporting of any related signs, while investigators assigned zones, guided reporting procedures, and oversaw activities to prevent uncontrolled efforts causing interference or disruption. As time passed without specific finds, the geographic scope systematically expanded from the initial neighborhood to main roads leading outward, nearby small commercial areas, parking lots, parks, playgrounds, public facilities, and spaces Liam might reach if continuing movement or led along natural routes. Each expansion required resource reallocation adjustments, as covering new terrain meant increased personnel, vehicles, and time, while sustaining prior area coverage to avoid gaps. Concurrently, large volumes of incoming information flowed from diverse sources: public tip calls on suspicious sightings, direct field reports from search teams, patrol observations during sweeps, and indirect informal channels, creating dense real-time data streams. Every tip, however minor, was logged with time, location, and source, then preliminarily categorized for verification priority, while field units were flexibly dispatched to check high-relevance report. Information processing placed heavy pressure on investigators, who constantly balanced rapid response to avoid missing opportunities against disciplined resource use to prevent wasting effort on low-reliability leads, especially as report volume grew exponentially with community attention. Such large-scale searches rapidly consumed substantial investigative resources, from personnel working extended stressful shifts, continuously used vehicles, to coordinators' time and focus. Sustaining high tempo over consecutive days required field commanders to continually assess force status, adjust shifts, reassign tasks, and ensure units remained effective without burnout or lost focus. Every resource addition or reduction decision directly impacted coverage capability, creating significant operational pressure given time's critical role in victim recovery odds. The entire search and resource deployment phase was characterized by high-intensity, non-stop activity, with participating forces tightly coordinating to expand geographic reach, scan as many areas as possible, and intake information as quickly as possible, while the investigative system operated continuously to ensure all field actions were logged direct and integrated in a unified effort to locate traces of Liam Wilson during the period deemed decisive for the entire case. When the large-scale search phase was deployed over multiple consecutive days without yielding any confirmatory discoveries, the investigation team was forced to enter the process of synthesizing and evaluating all the results obtained to determine whether the efforts expended had helped narrow down any possibilities or, conversely, were revealing serious limitations in the initial approach. The synthesis showed that most areas within the range determined based on the mobility capabilities of a 5-year-old child had been swept multiple times, both by official forces and support teams, but no physical signs or direct witnesses were recorded that could confirm the presence of Liam Wilson after the time believed to be his last appearance. The input information collected during the search process, despite being large in quantity, was mostly unverifiable or led to no specific conclusions, leaving the case file without additional decisive data compared to the early stage. In parallel with evaluating the search result, the investigation team also thoroughly reviewed potential communication channels to determine whether any ransom demands, messages, or signs of external contact existed, because in kidnapping-related cases, communication often serves as a critical indicator of the nature of the incident. However, up to this point, no ransom demands, indirect notifications, or any form of contact had been recorded, whether with Liam's family or with authorities, and this complete silence forced the investigation team to acknowledge that if an external actor was involved, their behavior did not follow the common pattern of kidnappings for economic purposes. The absence of communication also weakened the ability to identify the motive and identity of any potential subject, as there was no communication thread to analyze. Another factor brought into the evaluation was the possibility that Liam had been taken out of the local area, or even out of state, a scenario that could explain the lack of traces in the initial area. But when considering the available data, the investigation team found no evidence indicating interstate movement had occurred. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles, no witnesses seeing a child matching Liam's description at major transportation points, and no data from transportation facilities or public services indicating his presence in long-distance travel context. This lack of evidence did not allow the investigation team to expand the investigation to federal agencies at a deeper level, while reinforcing the assessment that if Liam had left the initial area, it happened without leaving traces trackable by the standard professional methods of that time. Meanwhile, reviewing the list of suspects and individuals previously considered also yielded no new progress, as none of them met sufficient criteria to reach the prosecution threshold under legal standard. Although some individuals previously of interest had details not fully explained, investigators could not build a strong enough evidentiary case to move them from consideration to formal accusation, especially in the context of no crime scene, no physical evidence, and no direct testimony. This put the investigation team in a difficult position, where they had to acknowledge that the initial hypotheses, though reasonable at the time of formulation, did not lead to a specific actionable outcome through law enforcement measure. This evaluation process also exposed the limitations of the operational decisions made in the early stage, when prioritizing certain hypotheses and early exclusion of some individuals, though based on logic and experience, did not create any breakthrough and may even have narrowed the investigation scope in an unintended way. Faced with that reality, the investigation team was forced to reconsider the feasibility of maintaining active investigation intensity, while resources were increasingly depleted without commensurate progress, especially as other cases also demanded the system's attention. The decision to scale down the investigation was not made abruptly, but was the result of a continuous evaluation process, in which commanders and investigators weighed continuing resource-intensive activities against the realistic possibility that the case lacked the necessary elements to advance further in the current stage. This scaling down manifested in reducing the intensity of active searches, focusing more on storing, systematizing, and preserving the collected data, while maintaining responsiveness if new valuable information emerged. The impasse formed not due to lack of effort, but due to a combination of multiple adverse factors, including no crime scene, no external communication, no evidence of long-distance movement, and no suspect meeting prosecution standards, creating a situation where the investigation system, despite operating at high intensity, could not take any further decisive step. In that context, the disappearance of Liam Wilson gradually shifted from an emergency situation to a file full of unfilled gaps, where every evaluation led to the same temporary conclusion that the available tools and methods had reached their limit, and continuing the investigation in the old manner would not yield different results in the short term. After internal evaluations confirmed that the active search and investigation efforts had not yielded substantial progress, the disappearance of Liam Wilson entered a systemic transition phase, not through a public announcement or a single decision, but via a series of administrative adjustments, reflecting the reality that the case no longer had sufficient elements to continue being handled as an emergency situation. The case file was subjected to a comprehensive review process, in which all documents collected from the early days, including initial report records, family and witness statements, search maps, field team reports, lists of excluded suspects, and operational notes, were re-systematized to ensure no data was lost or overlooked. This process aimed to shift the file from active investigation status to long-term monitoring storage, a technical step, but one marking the end of the phase where the case received continuous priority handling. Storage did not mean permanently closing the file, but it established that from this point, Liam's disappearance was no longer in the group of cases allocated full-time investigation resources. In parallel with the file transition process, investigators who had been directly involved began withdrawing from daily handling roles, not due to lack of concern or responsibility, but due to unit personnel allocation requirements, amid continuously emerging new cases. Some investigators were still assigned as contact points for the file, responsible for receiving and recording any new information if it appeared, but no dedicated team was maintained to pursue the case continuously. This withdrawal occurred gradually, reflecting the shift from emergency response status to passive monitoring status, where the case existed as a waiting file rather than an ongoing task. Along with personnel changes, the high-intensity active search operations that had been deployed were officially terminated, with no more large-scale sweep campaigns, no more planned mobilization of volunteer forces, and no more special resource deployments solely for searching for Liam. Instead, the case was placed in an information-responsive status, meaning authorities would only take action when new data was provided, rather than proactively generating data through searches as before. This change reflected an unavoidable reality in investigative work, where resources must be allocated to cases with greater potential for specific short-term results. For the Wilson family, the case transitioning to cold case status carried particularly heavy significance, as it marked the point where they realized the system no longer viewed Liam's disappearance as an emergency requiring immediate resolution. The family continued maintaining contact with police, but exchanges gradually became more updates than actions, with notifications that there was no new information and the file was still being kept for monitoring. In that context, the family began pursuing independent efforts within their limited capabilities, from self-searching for information, contacting potential supporters, to maintaining the case's presence in community memory through personal relationships. These efforts were not professional and could not replace the role of investigative agencies, but for the family, it was the only way to maintain the feeling that they had not given up, even as the system was forced to shift priority. In the broader scope of the local justice and security system, Liam Wilson's disappearance gradually lost priority compared to newly emerging cases, not because it was less serious, but due to the absence of ADUs making it unable to compete with cases requiring immediate intervention. Liam's file became one of many missing children files stored in the data repository, marked for long-term monitoring, but not allocated specialized resources, reflecting the harsh reality that the system must make painful choices in utilizing time and personnel. The case losing priority did not happen in a single moment, but was a gradual process. As updates became sparser, internal meetings no longer frequently mentioned the case, and the file was only open for specific reasons. This shift also meant responsibility for the case was transferred from active investigation units to file management departments, where the primary task was ensuring information was accurately stored, retrievable when needed, and ready for re-examination if conditions changed. For investigators who had worked on the case from the early days, witnessing the file being classified as a cold case brought a sense of incompleteness, as despite fully performing all professional steps within the capabilities and conditions of that time, they still had to accept that not every case could be resolved through effort and determination alone. Cold case status was thus not just an administrative label, but an official acknowledgement of the system's limitations at a specific time, where time, resources, and technology were not sufficient to overcome the case's gaps. For the Wilson family, this transition marked the beginning of a prolonged waiting period, where hope was no longer tied to vibrant search activities, but became a silent state, dependent on the possibility that one day, new information or a change in investigative conditions would bring Liam Wilson's file out of the silence of storage and back to investigators' desks. When Liam Wilson's missing person file officially entered cold case status in the investigation system, The life of the 5-year-old boy from that time did not stop or remain suspended like in archived files, but continued quietly elsewhere, under a completely different identity, detached from the name Liam Wilson, from Nashville, and from the biological family that had given birth to him. At an age too young to retain a complete sequence of events, Liam carried no clear memories of the day he disappeared. What remained, if anything, were only fragmented sensations, impressions not tied to specific places or people, gradually fading over time and overshadowed by new experiences. Under the newly established identity, he was introduced to the world as a normal child, with a different name, a different birth date on documents, and an origin story told in a simple, consistent, and sufficiently airtight way to avoid arousing suspicion from those around him. Liam's new living location was outside Nashville, in a different community with its own pace of life, where no direct connection existed to the disappearance that had once disrupted the memories of the city's residents years earlier, and where the name Liam Wilson held no special meaning. The move to the new environment was not perceived by Liam as a rupture, because at that age, his world was still forming day by day, and concepts of hometown or biological family were not deep enough to create a specific sense of loss. The replacement family or caretakers played a central role in shaping his entire reality, providing Liam with a stable routine structure, from housing, schooling, to daily habit, creating the necessary surface sense of security for a child to grow up without feeling something important was missing. In this environment, Liam was taught to address those around him with terms fitting the new identity story, explained his origins according to a pre-prepared version, and gradually accepted that information as the only truth he knew. The early years passed in the repetition of familiar activities, from going to school, learning to read and write, making friends, participating in basic community activities, to forming everyday habits, all creating a picture of outwardly completely normal life. Liam grew up in that environment like any other child, experiencing familiar developmental stages, learning to adapt to social rules, building friendships, and forming his own personality, while his true identity remained outside direct awareness, obscured by carefully controlled information. Living under a different name was not a conscious choice for Liam, but a state shaped by circumstances, where those around him had decided who he was before he was capable of questioning himself. The new living location gradually became his entire world, with streets, neighborhoods, schools, and familiar spaces completely replacing faint memories of another place he no longer clearly recalled. The replacement family or caretakers became the sole anchor in Liam's perception, creating an informationally closed world, where the past was tightly controlled, and the present presented as a seamless flow, without gaps or major questions. In that outwardly normal living environment, there were no public signs of confinement, coercion, or extreme isolation, but instead an effort to maintain a stable and familiar image, where Liam was allowed to integrate into society at a level sufficient, not to draw attention, but not encouraged to delve deeply into questions about personal origin. He participated in educational activities, had basic social relationships, experienced developmental milestones like peers, while questions about the past, if they arose, were usually answered with brief explanations, sufficient to soothe momentary curiosity, but not opening the door to the truth. This prolonged normality was not accidental but the result of an intentionally constructed environment, where every detail from personal documents, family story, to behavior toward outsiders, was kept consistent to avoid contradiction. Liam grew up without clear memories of his biological family, unaware that elsewhere, people had spent years in a state of waiting, searching, and hoping, because no bridge existed between those two worlds in his perception. Life elsewhere, under a different identity, thus took on the appearance of surface stability, with no signs indicating he had once been the center of a years-long missing person case, and where his existence blended into the community's general rhythm. In that context, Liam did not live as a victim in the traditional sense, not confined in a closed space, or isolated from society, but lived as a child raised in a replacement structure, where the truth about his identity was obscured by the veneer of everyday life. This very prolonged normality made his life not attract special external attention, while also making it harder to link this child to the old missing person file, as no surface signs indicated the two realities were related. The years passed in silence, with the new identity gradually rooting deeply into Liam's perception, creating a person growing up unaware that he had once belonged to a different story, a different family, and a past completely severed from his current life. Along with Liam Wilson living stably under a different name in a new environment, an alternative legal identity system was also established and consistently maintained over many years, allowing this individual to exist legally within basic administrative structures without being detected as matching any previously stored missing person records. The core of this process was the replacement birth certificate, the foundational document that establishes an individual's legal existence in most state systems, in which core information such as name, date of birth, place of birth, and legal guardian was recorded in a complete structure compliant with standard administrative norms. This birth certificate not only served to nominally confirm identity, but also acted as the basis for creating all related records, from education and health to basic civil administrative procedures, and was used consistently in all interactions with public authorities. On that foundation, educational records under the new identity were formed in accordance with the local education system's procedures, starting from preschool or elementary levels, with enrollment forms, report cards, grade progression records, and related documents, all reflecting the same set of personal data established in the replacement birth certificate. This information was updated regularly each school year, creating a continuous chain of educational data without clear interruptions, allowing the individual to appear in the education system as a normal student, without raising any unusual flags for the school or managing authorities. In parallel with the educational records, health records were also established and maintained under the same new legal identity, including basic data such as vaccination information, routine health checkups, treatment for common illnesses, and interactions with the healthcare system. These records were stored at local healthcare facilities, reflecting a healthcare history appropriate to the individual's age and living environment, while containing no links to any medical data prior to the establishment of the new identity. The management of personal information throughout this period followed principles of consistency and minimal change, with the exclusive use of a single set of identifying data for all administrative purposes, from education and health to basic community activities such as library registration, participation in recreational programs, or residency verification procedures. Information such as name, date of birth, address, and guardian was kept stable over time, avoiding unnecessary updates that could create inconsistencies across different data storage systems. However, despite the new legal identity structure being tight enough to operate smoothly in ordinary administrative processes, some inconsistencies existed at the detailed level, primarily related to data gaps in the early life stage. These inconsistencies could include the lack of prehistory information before the replacement birth certificate was established, incomplete newborn vaccination records, or minor differences in data recording between different administrative agencies, especially when the individual moved between localities or changed educational or healthcare providers. Under normal operating conditions of the administrative system, these inconsistencies were not significant enough to trigger in-depth review process, as the systems were designed to handle large volumes of data and accept a certain degree of variance, particularly in cases involving relocation or changes in living environment. Furthermore, in the context of data management technology of that era, administrative databases were not integrated in a way that allowed automatic cross-referencing between new identity records and repositories of missing children data, nor were biometric technologies widely applied to detect matches. This allowed the alternative legal identity to continue existing as an independent entity within the system, reinforced over the years by the repeated use of the same dataset in various contexts. The entire new identity structure operated like a closed-loop chain, in which each administrative record reinforced the others, creating a consistent data picture sufficient to pass routine checks, but still containing gaps that could only be identified through deeper comparison methods. Throughout this period, the new legal identity was not just a collection of isolated documents, but a continuously maintained data system, allowing the individual to exist legally in society without being detected as detached from another identity previously recorded in missing person files many years earlier. clearly reflecting the limitations of traditional data management mechanisms when faced with deliberately altered identities maintained consistently over time. Growing up and existing for many years under an identity that does not reflect true origins creates long-lasting consequences that are structural and develop over time, not manifesting immediately as obvious problems, but quietly accumulating in the process of forming Liam's personal identity, starting with the lack of information about his personal past. When the early years of life are not recorded or are replaced by a simplified narrative, Liam has no ability to access a seamless stream of memories about himself where the starting milestones of life, such as the actual place of birth, the first caregivers, or the circumstances of birth, exist as an unfillable void without direct experience. This void does not necessarily cause a crisis in the early stage, as the need for deep understanding of personal origins is not yet strong when young, but over time as awareness develops, and personal identity begins to form more clearly, the absence of foundational information gradually becomes a limitation that directly affects how Liam views himself and his place in the world. Along with the lack of past information come restrictions on the ability to access and control personal documents, not in terms of administrative data but in the proactive right to understand and confirm one's own identity, since most important information is out of reach and must go through the guardian. This prolonged dependence means Liam cannot independently compare, verify or question what is presented as truth, creating an asymmetrical relationship in controlling personal information, where one side holds all the facts and the other is forced to receive them passively. Dependence on the guardian extends beyond administrative procedures or documents into the realm of perception, as the entire story of origins, family and past, is filtered through another person's choice of information, severely limiting the ability to build a comprehensive personal narrative. This leads to a vague awareness of origins, where Liam knows he has a background and a life story from before, but that story lacks depth, specific details, and does not allow him to connect emotionally in a complete way, as it is presented as a fact to accept, rather than a history to explore. This vague awareness does not necessarily lead to clear doubt or open resistance, but it creates a suspended state in consciousness, where foundational questions like who am I or where do I come from lack a solid anchor, making the formation of personal identity more fragile compared to those with clear family history. Over time, these factors contribute to a lingering sense of not belonging, not tied to a specific place or relationship, but appearing as a background awareness that Liam always stands slightly off from those around him, even while outwardly integrating and fully participating in social activity. This sense of not belonging does not manifest as public separation or rebellious behavior, but often shows through caution in sharing about himself, wariness when talking about family or origins, and a tendency to avoid situations requiring detailed recounting of one's personal story. The lack of a clear past also affects the ability to build deep connections, as personal identity is formed not only from the present, but also from how a person understands, accepts, and recounts their own history, and when that history is obscured or simplified, connections built on that foundation tend to lack emotional depth. Prolonged dependence on the guardian for defining identity and personal story also diminishes the sense of autonomy, as Liam has no opportunity to experience self-discovery of origins as a personal journey, only receiving information one way, making the feeling of owning his life and history fade. This reinforces a background perception that his life is shaped more by external decisions than internal choices, even as surface aspects of life like studies, daily activities and social relationships proceed normally. The sense of not belonging thus does not appear as a specific, nameable pain but as a prolonged state, where Liam exists in social spaces without fully connecting, carrying an uncertainty about his position in the broader story of family and society. These consequences are not the result of a single event or momentary decision, but the accumulated product of many years living under a false identity, where each passing day reinforces an alternative reality, while also prolonging the disconnect between the current person and true origin, creating a state of existence where outward normality covers deep gaps in the structure of perception, identity, and sense of belonging. After Liam Wilson's disappearance, officially became a cold case and was no longer among the prioritized files in the investigation system, his birth family did not accept waiting in silence, but maintained a prolonged, persistent, and purposeful series of efforts to keep Liam present in official search systems as well as in the possibility of future recognition. The family continued searching in their own way, no longer through large-scale campaigns or broad community mobilization as in the initial phase, but by maintaining regular contact with authorities, updating information with any changes, and proactively reaching out to organizations and units specializing in missing persons to ensure Liam's file was not forgotten. These efforts were more long-term than immediate, focused on preserving data and accessibility rather than maintaining hope for quick results. A key step in the family's long-term strategy was providing DNA samples to authorities and related biological storage systems, viewing this as an objective means to keep Liam present in identification databases, even without specific clues about his location or current identity. Providing DNA was done with clear awareness that results would not come immediately, but it created a necessary condition for any future matching to occur accurately and independently of human memory. In parallel with providing biological samples, the family actively registered and maintained Liam's records in missing persons databases at various levels, from local to national, ensuring his information remained accessible and updated to new system standards. This process required ongoing monitoring as databases change over time, classification criteria are adjusted, and without proactive updates, records risk becoming outdated or deprioritized. The family thus acted as the final checkpoint, ensuring all information related to Liam remained consistent and complete in official systems. Along with maintaining existing data, the family closely followed technological advances in identification and missing persons search, particularly developments in DNA analysis, large-scale data matching, and new biometric technologies, hoping that limitations from the time of Liam's disappearance would gradually be overcome. This monitoring was not just passive, but guided family decisions in providing additional information, updating biological samples, or contacting new organizations when tools emerged capable of creating connections previously impossible. The family understood they lacked authority or resources to conduct professional investigations themselves, but they could ensure all necessary conditions for future re-verification were prepared. These ongoing efforts occurred amid many years without specific feedback or clear progress, requiring the family to maintain perseverance through fatigue, disappointment, and helplessness, while accepting that each action might not yield results now, but only serve as investment in unforeseen future possibility. Continuing the search in this way was no longer about finding him now, but became a strategy to preserve the possibility of being found, where the family acted as keepers ensuring Liam's file remained ready, not fully frozen in storage. Through providing DNA, maintaining database registrations, and tracking technological developments, the family created a potential bridge between past and future, even if that bridge could not yet be activated. These efforts were not showy or dramatic but carried out quietly, steadily, and systematically, reflecting a special form of perseverance, where hope was not placed in major breakthroughs, but in not overlooking any factor, no matter how small, that could help Liam Wilson's existence be recognized again in an investigation system that had changed in the technological context, far more advanced than at the time of his disappearance. After many years in which the disappearance of Liam Wilson remained in a state of administrative silence, with no new witnesses, no delayed statements, and no additional scene discoveries, the critical turning point in the case did not come from human sources or memory, but from a systemic shift in how biological data is collected, stored, and compared, specifically, the increasingly widespread application of genetic genealogy in identification efforts. Unlike traditional DNA methods which only allow direct matches between two pre-identified samples, genetic genealogy operates on an expansive principle, enabling the tracing of indirect blood relationships through partial match levels, thereby reconstructing family networks based on statistical probabilities. The application of this method became feasible as civilian and semi-official DNA databases grew rapidly, with millions of samples voluntarily submitted for genealogy, research, or personal services, creating a data space large enough for even distant blood connections to be detected. In that context, a DNA sample entered into the comparison system did not yield a direct match with any monitored missing person record, but it did show significant similarity indicators with several other samples from different family branches, indicating the existence of an indirect but sufficiently close blood relationship that could not be ignored. This non-complete match was immediately flagged as an anomalous signal, because in genetic genealogy analyses, cases without direct matches, but with high similarity levels, often suggest that the individual being analyzed may be living under a different identity than the original family record. From that starting point, the comparison process expanded horizontally as analysts proceeded to cross-reference the DNA sample against multiple databases, including law enforcement archives, civilian genetic genealogy systems, and biological datasets provided in prior cases. This process required a combination of computer algorithms and manual analysis, since determining the closeness of blood relationships depends not only on the number of matching DNA segments, but also on how those segments are distributed and correlated within the overall genealogical picture. Each round of comparison helped eliminate incompatible possibilities, as family branches that failed to meet criteria related to geography, timing, or blood structure were gradually removed from consideration. In parallel with the biological comparisons, basic administrative data was also used as a supplementary filter, not to confirm identity, but to rule out cases that were clearly unrelated due to large discrepancies in age, gender, or temporal context. Through each step, the list of suspected identities narrowed from a broad set of hundreds of theoretical possibilities down to a small group of individuals with administrative and biological records that matched to a certain degree. Within this group, one case began to stand out due to significant overlaps between the genetic genealogy indicators and unusual gaps in early life record, particularly the absence of biological and administrative data before a certain point, something that typically occurs only in cases of identity change or record disruption. This narrowing was not based on a single indicator, but on the convergence of multiple independent data layers, where each element alone might not be convincing, but together they formed an increasingly clear probabilistic pattern. As analysts dug deep, the identified genealogical connections began to show significant similarities with a family that had provided DNA samples years earlier in a child disappearance case in Nashville, creating a direct intersection between current biological data and a long-dormant cold case record. This linkage was not treated as a conclusion but as a biological hypothesis requiring rigorous verification, since in genetic genealogy analysis, the risk of random matches or misinterpretation always exists without strict validation procedure. Accordingly, similarity indicators were analyzed at multiple levels, from close blood relationships to more distant ones, to assess the actual probability that the two DNA samples shared a family origin. At the same time, genealogical data related to the Nashville family was re-examined at an overview level, focusing on birth timelines, geographic areas, and social context, to determine whether the biological match aligned with the historical reality of the disappearance. This process gradually formed a complex data picture, where pieces of information previously scattered across different systems began to connect through genetic genealogy as a central axis, allowing analysts to see relationships that traditional methods had previously been unable to detect. The narrowing of suspected identities continued as incompatible assumptions were eliminated, leaving an increasingly specific possibility that the individual carrying the analyzed DNA sample had a direct blood relationship with the family that reported Liam Wilson missing in Nashville. This connection did not emerge as a simple coincidence, but as the result of a series of comparisons, eliminations, and probabilizations, with each decision grounded in data and scientific method rather than speculation. The fact that genetic genealogy ultimately created a bridge between an individual living under a different identity and a long-standing missing person case clearly demonstrates the value of preserving biological data over extended periods, as DNA samples provided years earlier, once yielding no results, now became the key to unlocking an entirely new approach. This DNA breakthrough holds significance not only for one specific case, but also reflects a fundamental shift in how investigative systems can overcome the limits of time and silence when data is stored, connected, and analyzed with sufficiently powerful tools. In the Nashville case, genetic genealogy transformed what seemed like a frozen investigation into a solvable puzzle, not by creating new evidence, but by rearranging long-existing data into a new order, where blood relationships became the key to linking past and present. When the genetic genealogy analysis results reached a level of consistency sufficient to form a weighted investigative hypothesis, Liam Wilson's missing person file was officially reactivated in the system, marking a clear shift from passive archival status to a new proactive investigative phase with specific targets built on a scientific data foundation. This reactivation did not occur as a standalone action, but as the outcome of a series of internal evaluations, in which biological indicators, genealogical match levels, and potential links to a specific missing person record were carefully reviewed before an official decision was made. Responsibility for the case was transferred to the dedicated cold case unit, a department organized to handle long-pending files where working methods prioritized depth of analysis over rapid response and focus on restructuring information rather than broadly seeking new leads. Upon receipt, the cold case unit conducted a full review of the original Nashville case file, checking the storage status, integrity, and completeness of every document, from the initial report intake records, family and witness statements, to search reports, lists of eliminated suspects, and operational decisions made in the early days, months, and years. This process ensured that no data was overlooked or misassessed due to the passage of time, while creating a unified foundation for accurately integrating new data. In parallel with the file review, cold case investigators rebuilt the entire case from scratch, reconstructing the timeline in detail and placing each event, hypothesis, and investigative decision in its proper historical, legal, and technological context to understand why previous approaches had failed to yield concrete results. This rebuilding was not judgmental but focused on identifying investigative blind spots, information gaps, or objective limitations that the technology and data systems of that era could not overcome. During reconstruction, investigators paid special attention to details previously considered secondary or insufficient to pursue, as under the light of new biological data, those details could take on entirely different meaning. Simultaneously, the cold case unit implemented federal-level data comparisons, leveraging inter-system connectivity that had been virtually non-existent before, including databases for missing persons, civil identities, residency records, biological data, and other related archives. This federal cross-referencing was not aimed at finding a simple match, but at checking the consistency of the genetic genealogy hypothesis with recorded administrative and historical facts on a broad scale, thereby assessing the feasibility of identity verification based on existing data. Through this process, investigators could identify contradictions or data gaps that older systems could not detect, especially inconsistencies related to the formation of a new legal identity, interjurisdictional movement, and absences of information in early life. As data layers were placed side by side, from the original Nashville file to modern genetic genealogy results, a new investigative direction gradually became clear, shifting focus from searching for the victim in geographic space to verifying the identity of a specific individual legally existing under a different name. This investigative direction required a fundamental shift in operational mindset, as instead of expanding the search scope in hopes of random leads, investigators concentrated on deepening a data-supported assumption, using modern tools to verify each element sequentially and controllably. Establishing the new direction also meant reprioritizing resources, with emphasis placed on analysis, comparison, and data verification rather than large-scale field searches no longer suited to the case's nature at this stage. The cold case unit played a central role in this reactivation, not just as a new investigative team but as a mechanism connecting two different investigative eras, where the initial efforts of previous investigators were objectively re-examined and placed in a new analytical framework suited to modern technology. Reactivating the cold case file was thus not formalistic, but a substantive shift in case approach, As the Nashville file escaped the static state of storage to become an active case, once again in the investigative system, with clear objectives and defined method. Though the process had not yet yielded a final conclusion, it marked the moment when data previously fragmented and powerless against time began to be rearranged into a new structure, where DNA science, federal interconnectivity, and modern cold case thinking converge, creating a solid foundation for subsequent verification steps based on data rather than speculation, and opening the possibility of connecting past and present in a way the previous investigative system had never achieved. After Liam Wilson's file was reactivated and rebuilt to modern cold case standards, a mandatory step in the process was to review all 1999 operations to determine why the case had fallen into prolonged deadlock. Not to assign individual disciplinary blame, but to reevaluate old procedures from a systemic perspective, tracing points where data was lost, leads diluted, or investigative directions prematurely framed. The reevaluation of procedures began with how the case was received and classified in the first 24-72 hours, as initial classification decisions often dictate the entire chain of resource priorities, information collection methods, and search scope expansion. In the 1999 context, criteria for classifying child disappearances relied heavily on subjective assessments of no signs of violence and no evidence of abduction, rather than high-risk precautionary principles for children. When the file was reread chronologically, the cold case unit saw signs that the case had been pulled into the wandered-off trajectory for long enough to delay deployment of certain time-sensitive investigative measures, especially steps to collect trace evidence and lock down rapidly perishable information sources. Initial interviewing procedures, though conducted, revealed weaknesses of that era. Witness and family statements were recorded, but lacked standardized mechanisms to guard against memory distortion, lacked structured re-interviewing to peel away minor contradictions, and lacked systems to label reliability by collection timing, making it difficult when the case dragged on to revisit old statements without clarity on which details were direct observations, which were inferences, and which formed after news spread. In the review, investigators also reassessed 1999 search zoning and the no clear scene evaluation, as failing to identify a specific scene led to operations resembling a missing person campaign rather than an event investigation, potentially causing activities to focus on area coverage rather than preserving, collecting, and comparing small traces capable of providing direction. At the systemic level, prominent gaps identified related to data management and information interconnectivity. Many critical data sources existed in silos by agency jurisdiction. From residency records, school files, social worker reports, to lists of individuals with histories involving children, and access was often slow, manual, and dependent on interagency relationships rather than technical integration. This reduced cross-verification speed and forced investigators of that time to rely more on interviews and on-site verification. Another systemic gap was the collection and storage of victim identification data. Since Liam was very young, useful long-term identification features, such as distinctive medical marks, biological sample, high-quality standardized photos, if not standardized from the start, would be hard to compensate for later, and under 1999 technological conditions, digitization capacity, centralized storage, and sharing of photos identification features were uneven, increasing the risk of files becoming blurred over time. When compared to modern cold case standards, the unit also saw suboptimal or erroneous decisions that were operational rather than personal errors. For example, the priority given to quickly locking information channels on movement and contacts in nearby areas, or prematurely halting certain investigative directions after no ransom demand appeared, while in reality, many child abductions involve no extortion. Some eliminations from suspect and related persons lists were also re-evaluated, as 1999 exclusions often relied on schedule confirmations based on statements or limited verification, without strong digital data support, device locations, widespread cameras, electronic transaction histories, so the threshold for safe to eliminate may have been lower than current standards. Cold case investigators paid special attention to how the file shifted to low priority status relatively quickly after the initial search phase, leading to personnel dispersal, reduced re-review frequency, and thinning of the information collection network. While child disappearance cases require reminder mechanisms and periodic reviews to prevent small pieces of information from dying in drawers, from a management perspective, this reflected a common gap of that era. Lack of fixed timeline reevaluation procedures and lack of mandatory standards to update files into interregional data networks, even when cases showed no federal signs, reducing opportunities for coincidental cross-jurisdictional match. The review also analyzed the impact of technological limitations as a key factor shaping every 1999 decision. Surveillance cameras were not widespread, image quality was low, and retrieval storage capacity limited, making CCTV-based movement reconstruction nearly impossible. Mobile phone data of that period was cruder, with little continuous location tracking, and carrier record retrieval was slow, rendering digital timelines virtually non-existent. Missing persons and child databases were not deeply integrated with civilian systems. So even though the family diligently provided information, the ability to generate automatic match alerts was nearly zero. DNA was then mainly used for direct matches in narrow scopes, without genetic genealogy or large enough data infrastructure for indirect blood relationship map, so biological samples, if any, often sat dormant as a backup option with no known activation timeline. These limitations forced 1999 investigators to operate on a people location interview search model, where early perceptual biases could easily derail the entire system, as there was no strong digital data to pull it back. Therefore, when the cold case unit reviewed operational error, they did not merely list overlooked or inadequately performed steps, but more importantly, identified points where old procedures were prone to framing by early assumptions, where the system lacked bias correction mechanisms and tools for self-correction. The result of the review was a clearer picture of how the case slid from emergency status to deadlock. Not due to lack of effort, but due to the combination of strongly directive initial classification, data management gaps, insufficiently strict exclusion standards in a context lacking digital data, and technological limits preventing deployment of objective verification measures. On that evaluative foundation, the file was repositioned to its true nature under modern standards. A high-risk child disappearance with potential identity change, where the small deviations of 1999 are now understood as breakpoints in the investigative chain, fully documented to serve as the basis for the new reinvestigation approach without repeating old limitations. After the cold case file of Liam Wilson was reactivated and the systematic procedural errors from 1999 were identified, the next step in the investigative process was to re-interview all witnesses and individuals who had appeared in the original file, treating this as a process of refreshing human data to assess the durability, accuracy, and usability of statements that had existed for many years. The summoning of witnesses was not done in a narrowly selective manner, but based on a list rebuilt from scratch, including family members, those who directly or indirectly observed the period before and after Liam's disappearance, individuals who had provided information but were not followed up on in depth, as well as suspects who had been considered and then excluded during the initial investigation. The goal of this broad summoning was not to seek a late confession, but to ensure that no human source of information was overlooked in the context of new scientific data that had altered the case's analytical framework. The interviews were conducted with a more standardized structure than in 1999, based on the reconstructed file, allowing investigators to approach each witness with a set of questions designed to recreate specific event milestones while observing how memories were restructured after many years. The focus of this phase was comparing old and new statements, not to find contradictions that could be incriminating, but to identify natural changes in memory, details that had been overlooked, simplified, or unconsciously adjusted over time. When placing the two versions of statements side by side, investigators could more clearly distinguish what information stemmed from direct observation at the time of the events, what was speculation added later, and what memories might have been influenced by rumors, media, or common community assumptions. In many cases, the differences did not lie in the core content, but in how the witness expressed it, the level of certainty when mentioning a specific detail, or the order in which events on the day Liam disappeared were arranged. Factors that had previously been deemed not significant enough to alter the entire investigative direction. However, when placed in the context of new DNA data and analyses, these small differences began to take on meaning, as they could indicate that the original timeline had been inaccurately compressed or expanded due to a lack of objective anchor points. During the re-interview, some changed details were discovered, not in a way that completely reversed the story, but in witnesses adjusting estimated time markers, relative positions, or sequences of actions, reflecting how memories are restructured when no longer under the pressure of the initial emergency situation. Previously excluded suspects were also reapproached using the same principles, with the aim of reassessing the certainty of the prior exclusion grounds in the context of the information and technology limitations. Investigators did not view this re-interviewing as a reversal of old decisions, but as a step to re-evaluate the solidity of those decisions, especially cases excluded primarily based on statements or subjective schedule confirmation. In these interviews, the internal consistency of each statement was prioritized, that is, how a witness maintained or changed their story when approached from different angles, thereby helping to assess the stability of the memory and its likelihood of reflecting actual events. Newly collected information was not considered in isolation but always placed alongside the old file, creating a comparison matrix that allowed clear visibility of matching points, discrepancies and gaps that had never been filled. Through this, some details previously deemed secondary began to be reconsidered, not because they were decisive in themselves, but because they contributed to adjusting the overall picture of the day of the incident. From the updated interview data, revising the timeline became a necessary procedural step, in which time markers were refined based on the combination of new statements, old statements, and verified administrative facts, creating a timeline that more accurately reflected the uncertainty inherent in human memory, while still maintaining a logical structure for the investigation. The new timeline was not seen as a complete replacement for the old version, but existed alongside it as an adjusted version, with each marker assigned a different level of reliability, allowing investigators to clearly understand which data had high certainty and which areas required caution in reasoning. The entire process of re-interviewing old witnesses and suspects was thus not mere recollection, but a purposeful procedural step, refreshing human data by placing it within a modern analytical framework, where memory is viewed as a source of information that needs verification and calibration rather than acceptance at face value. The outcome of this phase was not the final resolution of the case, but a more solid data foundation, where the timeline had been updated, details reclassified by reliability level, and old assumptions separated from actual data, advancing the file one important step in the process of verifying identity and clarifying what really happened around the time Liam Wilson disappeared. After the DNA data, administrative records, and witness statements were restructured and placed within the same analytical framework, the investigative unit reached a pivotal step, redefining the nature of the Liam Wilson case, as the assumptions that had dominated the entire investigation for many years were no longer compatible with what modern data was indicating. First, the hypothesis of a traditional violent abduction was systematically phased out, not because it had never been reasonable at the initial time, but because the core characteristics of this type of crime did not match the clarified chain of facts. The absence of signs of forced entry, no witnesses to violent acts, no ransom demands, no evidence of coerced movement shortly after Liam's disappearance, combined with the victim continuing to exist long-term in society under a different identity, made the violent abduction for harm or extortion model no longer a fitting explanation. Instead, investigators recognized that the case's characteristics aligned more with a form of child identity theft, where the goal was not immediate physical harm, but separating the victim from their original identity and integrating them into a new identification system for long-term undetected existence. Identifying identity theft became the new focus of understanding the case, as the facts showed that Liam was not disappeared in a complete physical sense, but reborn legally within a YIA's administrative structure with a new name, records, and life history established from scratch. Looking back at the entire process, investigators saw that the core behavior lay not in the moment Liam left his initial environment, but in the subsequent chain of actions to maintain the new identity over many years, which required a certain understanding of administrative process, the ability to exploit control gaps, and persistence in keeping data consistent over time. The method was thus determined not to be a single act, but a prolonged process, starting with separating the child from their birth family in an inconspicuous circumstance, then quickly establishing or accessing a replacement legal identity, sufficient to allow the child to be recorded in basic systems, such as healthcare, education, and residency. This method relied on exploiting the reality that in the late, many identity management systems still operated in a decentralized manner, dependent on physical documents and lacking cross-regional verification mechanisms, making a child appearing in the system under a different name not immediately trigger alert. Investigators also determined that for this method to succeed, the perpetrator did not necessarily need deep legal knowledge, but only enough understanding to exploit default procedure, where administrative agencies often prioritized addressing a child's immediate needs over tracing origins when there were no clear signs of violation. When framing the case as identity theft, many previous decisions and phenomena became more understandable, from the lack of contact with the birth family, no traces of demands or threats, to the victim being able to live stably for a long time without detection. At the same time, this new understanding also explained why initial search efforts, focused on local areas and potential violence, failed to break through, as the subject was not hidden in a fixed physical space, but integrated into society under a legal cover. From a legal perspective, redefining the case's nature also exposed the system's vulnerabilities at that time, particularly in protecting child identities and preventing the creation of replacement legal records without strong cross-verification mechanisms. Investigators noted that in 1999, many administrative procedures prioritized speed and humanitarianism, allowing guardians to provide information on behalf of children without requiring high-level authentication, especially in cases presented as special circumstances or interlocal moves. These vulnerabilities were not isolated, but reflected a system not yet designed to counter long-term identity theft scenarios, where each individual step appeared legal, but collectively led to erasing an individual's true identity. Redefining the case was thus not just changing the classification label, but adjusting the entire view of the criminal behavior, from a single violent event to a years-long process of administrative and social manipulation. This understanding allowed investigators to connect previously seemingly unrelated data fragments, such as minor administrative inconsistencies, record gaps, and the outward stability of the victim's life, into a consistent logical model. At the same time, it placed the Liam Wilson case in a specific crime category, where the boundary between criminal violation and exploiting legal loopholes became blurred, and where the consequences lay not only in a child being separated from their family, but in their personal identity being reshaped without consent or awareness. Establishing the case's nature in this direction created a new conceptual foundation for the entire subsequent investigation, freeing authorities from old assumptions about violence or extortion, and focusing on clarifying how the identity was stolen, maintained, and concealed within a legal system with certain gaps, thereby advancing the case, an important step from the verification phase, to clarifying responsibility and the mechanisms of the incident. After the case's nature was redefined and the investigation clearly focused on identity theft, the entire process was pushed to its most critical phase, confirming that the individual living under a different name was indeed Liam Wilson, the child who went missing in Nashville in 19. This phase was not speculative or exploratory, but implemented as a tight sequence of scientific and legal procedures, with each step aimed at completely eliminating any possibility of error, mistake, or subjective interpretation. The primary focus was the final DNA comparison under identity confirmation standards, fundamentally different from prior genealogical analyses that were only orientational. This time, the suspected individual's DNA sample was collected directly under strictly controlled conditions, with a monitored chain of custody process to ensure absolute integrity from collection to analysis. This sample was directly compared with DNA samples from the birth parents and close blood relatives of the Wilson family that had been stored in the system for years, using high-resolution genetic markers that allowed determination of blood relations at near absolute probability levels. The analysis process did not stop at a single laboratory, but was performed in parallel or cross-verified by independent units to eliminate risks of technical deviation or statistical error. when the results showed a match far exceeding all accepted forensic science probability thresholds. The blood relationship between the tested individual and the Wilson family was officially confirmed, no longer in the realm of suspicion or possibility, but as a scientific conclusion with legal value. This confirmation of blood relations had significance beyond pure investigation, as it created an irreversible milestone in the file, where Liam Wilson's true identity was restored based on objective evidence rather than statements or memories. Immediately after confirmation, Liam's status in missing persons management systems was updated across the board, shifting from unresolved missing to confirmed alive and identity verified, while attaching new authentication details to ensure the file no longer existed as an unsolved case. This status update was not merely administrative, but triggered a series of internal mechanisms in the system, requiring related databases to review the parallel existence of the old and new identities to prevent the two entities from continuing independently and causing future confusion. Based on the DNA confirmation, authorities began preparing subsequent legal steps with special caution, as this was not a typical case where identity determination meant closing the file. Legal preparation focused on re-establishing the legal status of the individual, confirmed as Liam Wilson, while fully considering the consequences arising from this person having legally existed under a different identity for a long time. Civil records related to the current identity were reviewed to assess validity, scope of impact, and necessary adjustments, ensuring that restoring the true identity did not cause sudden disruption or harm to legitimately formed rights over many years. In this phase, the emphasis was not on immediate criminal prosecution, but on establishing a stable legal foundation, allowing subsequent decisions to be made on a clearly confirmed identity base. Involved agencies carefully considered the sequence and scope of record adjustments, aware that any error could create long-term consequences for the newly confirmed individual, who had built a life, relationships, and legal obligations under a different identity. Confirming Liam Wilson's identity was thus not seen as the case's endpoint, but as a shift from the truth-seeking phase to handling the consequences of that truth, where science, administration, and law converged fully for the first time in a final confirmatory decision. This phase also clearly reflected the fundamental evolution of the investigative system over time, when biological data, once insufficient for breakthroughs, now became decisive evidence, thanks to technological advancements and information interoperability. Preparing post-confirmation legal steps was done with the understanding that this was the foundation for the entire subsequent process, from adjusting documents and protecting individual rights, to considering the responsibility of involved parties, and every decision needed to be placed in a context ensuring stability, legality, and humanity for the person just confirmed as Liam Wilson. After Liam Wilson's identity was irrevocably confirmed through DNA evidence, and the foundational legal preparations were completed, the reunification process was implemented as a distinct, clearly structured, and tightly controlled phase, aimed at transforming the investigation's conclusions into a stable living reality for both Liam and his biological family. First, the legal confirmation of identity was carried out through the necessary administrative and judicial decisions, in which the competent authorities officially recognized Liam as the biological child of the Wilson family according to legal records, while simultaneously updating his civil status in the system, ensuring that the scientifically proven blood relationship was fully and consistently reflected within the legal framework. This confirmation step was not merely to complete a procedure, but to create a solid legal foundation so that all subsequent interactions between Liam and his biological family could take place in a state protected by rights and obligations, avoiding legal gray areas that could lead to conflicts or misunderstandings. On that legal basis, the organization of family meetings was conducted according to a cautious plan, viewing this not as a performative or spontaneously emotional moment, but as a sensitive transitional step in the lives of multiple individuals who had experienced very different years. The meeting was thoroughly prepared in terms of timing, location, and form of contact, with the goal of minimizing psychological shock and allowing the parties to approach each other in a neutral, safe space with necessary support. The encounter was not designed as a single event that would close all gaps, but as the starting point of a reacquaintance process, where Liam and his biological family had the opportunity to recognize each other in the present reality rather than attempting to recreate a relationship that had been interrupted many years earlier. In that process, the parties were encouraged to approach each other at a suitable pace, avoiding immediate expectations of complete bonding, while respecting the life experiences and identity that Liam had formed during the time he existed under a different identity. Parallel to organizing the meeting, a series of personal record adjustments was systematically implemented to reflect the change in legal identity without causing sudden disruptions to Liam's current life. Civil, educational and medical records were updated according to a roadmap, ensuring that the true identity was fully recorded while maintaining the necessary continuity, avoiding administrative conflicts or impacts on rights that had been established over many years. This adjustment required close coordination among relevant agencies, as the goal was not just to correct data, but to ensure that the identity transition occurred smoothly, transparently, and without placing Liam in a position of facing overly rapid or complex changes at the same time. Factors related to personal documents, educational history, medical records and other legal relationships were reviewed and adjusted according to the principle of prioritizing stability and legal safety for the newly confirmed individual. Alongside administrative adjustments, the establishment of psychological support was seen as a key pillar of the reunification phase, because this event not only brought joy or a sense of closing a long journey, but also entailed complex and sometimes conflicting emotions for all involved parties. For Liam, having his identity confirmed and reuniting with his biological family meant integrating a new truth into the personal identity built over many years, a process requiring time and professional support to avoid feelings of disorientation or pressure to choose between relationships. For the biological family, the reunion was both the end of waiting and loss, and the opening of new challenges in rebuilding a relationship with an adult child who was no longer the young boy from years ago. Psychological support was therefore not implemented as a short-term measure, but as a long-term accompanying program, helping the parties process emotions, adjust expectations, and learn to interact in the new context. The participating experts acted as mediators, creating a safe space for the parties to express emotions, ask questions, and gradually form relationship frameworks suitable for the current reality, rather than being dominated by idealized images of the past. The entire reunification process was shaped as an extended transitional phase, where the law confirmed the truth, administration ensured stability, and psychological support helped the parties adapt, rather than viewing the first meeting as the end of the story. In that context, Liam Wilson's reunion with his biological family carried meaning deeper than a moment of reconnection, becoming a process of restructuring personal and family life, where the truth was acknowledged but not imposed, and relationships were rebuilt cautiously and sustainably. This phase thus both closed a long chapter of disappearance and searching, and opened a new one requiring patience, understanding and ongoing coordination, to ensure that Liam's return existed not only on paper or in memory, but could truly integrate into the current lives of all those involved. After the reunion was established, and Liam Wilson's identity was recognized in both reality and law, the case entered a new phase no longer centered on searching or verification, but focused on addressing the lingering legal and social consequences arising from an identity theft that had persisted for many years. First, changing and adjusting personal documents became a complex process that could not be resolved with a single administrative decision, because the identity Liam had used for so long was tied to a series of rights, obligations, and legal relationships that had been formed. The relevant authorities had to review and adjust each type of document according to a roadmap, from basic identity papers to records related to education, health, employment and other civil obligations, to ensure that the true identity was fully restored without causing legal conflicts or invalidating rights that had been lawfully established previously. This process required flexibility in applying the law, as the system had to simultaneously acknowledge the reality that the old identity existed due to theft, while also protecting the individual who had lived under that identity from unjust legal consequences. Parallel to administrative adjustments, long-term psychological consequences began to manifest more clearly as Liam and his biological family entered the post-reunion adaptation phase. Restoring the true identity did not automatically resolve the internal conflicts that had accumulated over many years, but instead raised new questions about identity, sense of belonging, and the relationship between past and present. For Liam, integrating two life stages with two different identities created a prolonged psychological adjustment process, where he had to learn to accept that experiences under the old identity remained a valid part of himself, while building connections with his biological family without denying the reality that it existed. For the biological family, welcoming an adult child with a separate life posed challenges in balancing the closure of loss with the reality that the relationship could not return to its original state. These psychological consequences did not manifest as immediate crises, but appeared as small yet prolonged adjustments, affecting how the parties interacted, set expectations, and rebuilt relationships in the long term. At the societal level, the case quickly attracted media attention, not only because of the reunion after many years, but also due to the questions it raised about child safety, identity management, and the limits of the legal system in preventing prolonged theft. The media played a dual role in this phase. On one hand, helping bring the story to light and creating pressure for relevant agencies to handle it transparently and comprehensively. On the other, carrying the risk of simplifying or dramatizing the experiences of those involved, turning a complex legal social process into a formulaic story. Managing media information thus became an important part of handling social consequences, to ensure that the privacy and psychological stability of Liam and his biological family were respected, while still meeting the public's need for transparency. Finally, the issue of legal responsibility was raised cautiously, as the case not only involved an individual act from the past, but also reflected systemic vulnerabilities that allowed the act to occur and persist. The authorities had to examine responsibility at multiple levels, from the direct actions leading to the identity theft, to shortcomings in administrative processes and child protection that failed to detect or prevent it in time. Examining this responsibility was not only for prosecution purposes, but also to draw lessons and adjust policies, minimizing the risk of recurrence in the future. In that context, the legal and social consequences of the Liam Wilson case did not end with the reunion, but continued to ripple through how the legal system, administrative agencies, and society viewed issues of identity, child protection, and collective responsibility. This was the phase where the case shifted from a personal story to a typical example, forcing society to confront larger questions about how legal and administrative gaps could profoundly impact human lives over long periods, and how the lessons learned should not stop at one resolved case. After Liam Wilson's identity was confirmed, and the initial legal social consequences were addressed, the investigation returned to the central unresolved question: who directly or indirectly carried out the series of actions that led to Liam being separated from his biological family and living under a different identity for many years, and under current conditions, to what extent the legal system could still establish responsibility. The perpetrator investigation phase was conducted by narrowing down potential suspects based on all the restructured data from previous sections, where the scope was no longer broad, as in the early stage of the case, but focused on individuals who had the opportunity for direct access to Liam in the period before and immediately after his disappearance, while also having the practical conditions to maintain an alternate identity over a long time. This narrowing was based on the intersection of witness data, updated timelines, identified administrative gaps, and the social context of 1999, allowing the elimination of most incompatible possibilities and reducing the list to a group of suspects with behavioral characteristics and access opportunities matching the established nature of the identity theft. However, narrowing did not mean immediately identifying the perpetrator, as many elements necessary for charging were no longer available or could not be recreated after so much time. Parallel to the narrowing process, investigators re-evaluated all remaining evidence in the file, including documents, reports, statements, and indirect data collected in the past, but lacking sufficient value at that time. This re-evaluation was conducted through the lens of the new understanding of the case, allowing pieces of evidence once seen as disjointed or irrelevant to be placed together to assess mutual support potential. Some data, when revisited in the context of identity theft, carried different meaning than the initial interpretation, but still faced severe limitations in provability according to criminal procedure standards. Much physical evidence was gone, paper records lost or degraded, and witness memories, though refreshed through re-interviews, could not achieve the accuracy needed to withstand legal scrutiny after decades. These difficulties became evident when assessing prosecution viability, as criminal procedure evidence standards require a high degree of certainty, not only in proving the act occurred, but also in clearly identifying the perpetrator, intent, and the causal relationship between the act and the prolonged consequences. Investigators had to carefully weigh reasonable inferences based on aggregated data against what could be convincingly proven in court, recognizing that not every investigative conclusion could translate into a valid criminal charge. Another major challenge lay in statutes of limitations and changes in the legal framework over time. As acts occurring in 1999 were governed by different regulations than today, and the principle of non-retroactivity significantly limited the application of newer, stricter rules. This led to the reality that some acts, though now viewed as particularly serious from moral and social perspectives, were no longer prosecutable or could only be considered to a limited extent under the law at the time of occurrence. Additionally, proving a continuous chain of actions over many years required particularly high evidence, while most actions maintaining the alternate identity occurred within seemingly legal administrative processes, making the boundary between criminal acts and exploiting systemic loopholes difficult to legally define. In that context, the final legal status of the perpetrator investigation was determined cautiously and transparently, reflecting the balance between efforts to clarify responsibility and the legal reality that did not allow going beyond the current level of proof. The investigation file fully recorded the conclusions reached, including the nature of the acts, the group of potential suspects, and the factors preventing prosecution or ensuring courtroom success. This did not mean denying or downplaying the wrongdoing that occurred, but acknowledging that the legal system operates within specific constraints of evidence, time, and procedure, especially in cases spanning decades. The final legal status thus reflected a practical closing point of the criminal investigation, where historical truth could be reconstructed to the highest possible degree, but not always fully resolved through a verdict. The perpetrator investigation phase ended not with a simple judgment, but with a comprehensive assessment of the system's capabilities and limits when facing prolonged identity thefts, while leaving a complete, transparent file as a basis for drawing experience, improving policy, and preventing similar scenarios in the future. After Liam Wilson's identity was confirmed by DNA, the missing person file in Nashville was officially changed to resolved in terms of victim identification, but not fully closed in the sense of criminal investigation, reflecting a complex outcome where the core truth was illuminated while some aspects remained beyond the system's ability to fully resolve. The current status of the case was clearly recorded. The victim is alive, the true identity has been established, and administrative records have been updated to reflect this reality, while the perpetrator investigation reached the maximum possible based on remaining evidence and current legal constraints. However, alongside that confirmation were questions that could not be resolved conclusively, including precisely identifying the individual or group directly responsible for the identity theft, the initial motive leading to this act, and the degree of involvement of intermediary factors in the multi-year chain of events. These questions were not ignored or forgotten in the file, but recorded as points that could not be concluded due to objective limitations of time, evidence, and legal framework, showing the clear boundary between illuminating historical truth and the ability to pursue criminal responsibility. From a professional perspective, the case left many important investigative lessons. Foremost, the importance of correctly classifying risk levels from the initial stage in child missing cases, as early assumptions can shape the entire subsequent chain of decision. The case falling into cold case status did not stem from lack of effort, but from a combination of professional decisions influenced by technological limitations, fragmented data management, and legal vulnerabilities of that era, emphasizing the need to build mechanisms against systemic bias, rather than relying solely on individual judgment. Another lesson was the long-term value of preserving data, especially biological data, as DNA samples collected without immediate results became the decisive key years later, when technology had matured enough to exploit them. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining open and updated files, even without progress, as the potential for future data connections depends directly on whether information is preserved and standardized. On a broader level, the significance of the Liam Wilson case extended beyond a single instance, becoming evidence of how seemingly dead-end cold cases can be resolved through the convergence of science, data management, and modern investigative thinking. The application of genetic genealogy not only helped identify the victim, but also changed the approach to long-term missing persons cases, where the victim may no longer be physically detained or hidden, but legally existing under a different identity. This opened a new perspective for similar files, encouraging authorities to re-examine old cases from the angle of identity theft and exploiting administrative loopholes rather than focusing only on traditional violent scenarios. At the same time, the case also raised demands for systemic reform, from enhancing data interoperability, standardizing child identity protection processes, to building a more flexible legal framework to handle acts spanning different historical legal phases. The conclusion of the Liam Wilson case was therefore not absolutely closed, but like a deliberate popping point, where the essential truth was confirmed, limitations were acknowledged, and lessons were drawn for the future. In that picture, the greatest meaning of the case lay not only in finding a missing person alive, but in the ability of the modern investigative system to revisit, correct and complete what was once impossible, bringing realistic hope to thousands of other cold cases, still awaiting a chance to be re-examined in the light of science and data. In the United States today, the Liam Wilson story reminds us that safety is not just locking doors or telling children not to talk to strangers, but also how families protect their child's identity and data in an increasingly digitized society. In 1999 in Nashville, Liam disappeared in a brief moment when the caregiver hesitated in the face of an initial danger signal. That detail highlights the first lesson when caring for children: prioritize the no-ambiguity principle over politeness. If something is off, a stranger approaching, an offer of help, a situation that makes you hesitate, act according to a prepared script. Keep the child within reach, leave the risk area, call family or not. The second lesson comes from the cold case phase. Liam's family never gave up. They provided DNA samples, registered in missing persons databases, and followed technological progress until genetic genealogy created the breakthrough. This suggests practical steps in America. Keep records of your child's identification, regularly updated clear face photos, descriptions of distinctive marks, dental medical information if available, and if an incident occurs, provide information to authorities as soon as possible. The third lesson is about identity theft rather than violent abduction. Liam lived under a different identity for years because of fragmented paperwork systems and lack of cross-checking. In current life, proactively protect your child's social security number, monitor credit reports. Many places allow credit freezes for children, and be wary of anyone requesting your child's to speed up procedure. Finally, Liam's reunion shows that truth does not automatically heal everything. Psychological support and a pace that respects the experiences of those involved are needed. In America, seeking a counselor therapist is normal, and sometimes that's what helps a family turn being found into truly living again sustainable. If the story of Liam Wilson has made you think differently about missing persons cases that seem forgotten, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on the journey to uncover the truth for unsolved cold cases. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where another story awaits to be retold in the light of time and justice.